Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
All right. This time, we're going deep into the world of hallucinogens.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, and you guys sent in some really fascinating stuff for us to dig into.
I know. I was really excited to see this one come through.
Yeah, especially those excerpts from that university course on addictive substances. I was particularly interested in how they distinguish between classic hallucinogens and dissociative drugs.
Yeah, before I even started reading through the research, I have to admit my perception of hallucinogens was pretty much informed by pop culture.
Right.
All those stories and myths. So I was really curious to see how these categories actually break down, scientifically.
Yeah, like you were reading my mind.
Uh-huh.
So let's break it down. The course material mentions classic hallucinogens like LSD
Right.
and psilocybin, and then you've got dissociative drugs like PCP,
Uh-huh.
ketamine, DXM,
Yep.
and even salvia divinorum.
Oh, yeah.
What makes them different?
Well, so both types alter your perceptions,
Right.
but they each work on different pathways in the brain. So classic hallucinogens primarily affect serotonin pathways,
Okay.
especially in the prefrontal cortex.
And why is that significant?
So the prefrontal cortex is like the CEO of your brain.
Okay.
It's responsible for things like decision-making, planning, and personality. So when a classic hallucinogen like LSD disrupts serotonin there, it's like throwing a wrench in the gears of
Yeah.
your brain's, executive function.
Yeah.
That's why people experience hallucinations and a distorted sense of reality.
That makes sense. The course material actually mentions that LSD can even cause synesthesia,
Oh, wow.
which is when your senses get mixed up.
Right.
Like you might see sounds or hear colors.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Exactly. It's a great example of how messing with serotonin signaling in the prefrontal cortex can lead to some really bizarre and fascinating perceptual changes.
Now, what about dissociative drugs? How do they create that feeling of detachment from reality?
So dissociatives work a bit differently. They disrupt glutamate activity,
Okay.
specifically at NMDA receptors.
Gotcha.
And glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, so when you block its activity, it's like hitting the mute button
Hmm.
on certain parts of the brain.
So it's less about distorting reality and more about shutting it off.
In a way, yeah. Think of it like this. Your brain usually creates a cohesive sense of self
Okay.
and your place in the world.
Right.
Dissociatives disrupt that process, leading to feelings of depersonalization and derealization.
Uh-huh.
You might feel like you're watching yourself from outside your body,
Whoa.
or that the world around you isn't real.
That's kind of unsettling.
Yeah.
And salvia divinorum.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like it's in a league of its own.
It really is. Unlike classic hallucinogens or dissociatives, salvia divinorum targets kappa opioid receptors.
Interesting.
These are completely different from the receptors activated by drugs like heroin or morphine.
So even though it's categorized as a hallucinogen, it works in a totally different way.
Exactly. That just goes to show how diverse this class of substances is. And that diversity extends to the way people experience these drugs, too.
Yeah, it's the trip itself.
Hmm.
The course material talks about all sorts of short-term effects,
Mm-hmm.
from sensory distortions
Yeah.
to physical changes.
It's really a spectrum. Some people report feeling euphoric and energized,
Okay.
while others experience intense anxiety or paranoia. You might see vivid hallucinations, feel
Right.
like your body is changing shape, or even have out-of-body experiences. It's wild.
And it seems like so much depends on the individual,
Right.
the dosage, even their surroundings.
Oh, absolutely.
One person's magical journey could be another person's worst nightmare.
Absolutely. There was this one study mentioned in the material where researchers gave the same dose of psilocybin to two different groups of people.
Okay.
One group was in a comfortable, familiar setting,
Okay.
while the other was in a more clinical, sterile environment. You know what happened? The group in the comfortable setting reported much more positive and mystical experiences, while the other group had more negative and anxious reactions.
So set and setting really do matter.
Oh, sure.
It's not just the drug itself.
Yeah, it's a complex interplay of factors.
Right.
Your mindset going into the experience, your past experiences, your expectations, all of these things contribute to the overall trip.
So even though there are some common themes, it sounds like predicting how you'll react to a hallucinogen is pretty much impossible.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to approach these substances with caution and respect, because as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, the potential downsides are just as important to understand as the fascinating effects.
I'm intrigued. We'll be right back after a short break.
Yeah, it's fascinating how unpredictable these substances can be.
Right.
You never really know which way the experience will go.
Yeah.
And speaking of unpredictability, what about the long-term effects?
That's what really makes me pause. Even if a trip sounds exciting, the potential for things to go wrong long term is a serious consideration.
Right.
What stood out to you in the material?
Well, the course material mentions something called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder,
Oh, yeah.
or HPPD for short. And it's pretty rare, but imagine having flashbacks, visual disturbances,
Hmm.
and other perceptual issues long after the drug has worn off.
That sounds pretty unsettling.
Yeah, it's not a good time.
Have you come across any research on why some people experience HPPD and others don't?
That's one of the mysteries researchers are still trying to unravel.
Right.
There's no clear-cut answer, which makes it all the more concerning.
It's like a lingering shadow over the whole experience.
Yeah.
The source also mentioned the risk of persistent psychosis, which sounds even more serious.
Absolutely. Persistent psychosis can involve, disorganized thoughts, paranoia, mood swings that can last for weeks, months, or even longer. It's a stark reminder that these substances, while potentially fascinating, can have lasting and detrimental effects on mental health.
Right, and it's interesting because that brings us back to the conversation that seems to be happening more and more these days,
Uh-huh.
which is the potential therapeutic use of hallucinogens.
Yeah.
The source touched on LSD's resurgence in the 90s rave culture,
Right.
but things have shifted quite a bit since then, haven't they?
You're right. There's been a significant shift in perspective. We're
Yeah.
seeing a growing body of research exploring the potential benefits of substances like psilocybin
Okay.
in treating conditions like depression, anxiety, and even addiction.
So it's less about drugs are bad and more about how can we harness their power responsibly.
Exactly. But it's crucial to strike a balance.
Right.
While the potential for therapeutic use is exciting, it's not about endorsing recreational use or dismissing the potential harms.
Of course.
Any therapeutic application would need strict controls and monitoring.
It sounds like we're at a turning point.
Yeah.
Before it was all about the dangers, and now the conversation is becoming much more nuanced.
For sure. And the legal landscape is evolving too.
Yeah.
Some places are decriminalizing or even legalizing certain substances,
Right.
while others maintain strict prohibitions.
Hmm.
It creates a complex and often confusing situation.
Speaking of complexity, we haven't even touched on the cultural and historical context.
Right?
Hallucinogens have been used for centuries in spiritual and ritualistic practices.
Right. Many indigenous cultures have a long tradition of using these substances in ceremonies and healing practices. It adds a whole other layer of understanding to the conversation.
It's almost as if our current views on hallucinogens are just a tiny blip
Yeah.
in a much larger historical narrative.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating.
And what's really interesting is how those historical and cultural perspectives are starting to intersect with modern science. We're seeing a sort of convergence of ancient wisdom and modern research, which could lead to new and innovative approaches to mental health and well-being.
Makes you wonder if there are valuable insights we've overlooked because of the stigma surrounding these substances.
It's certainly possible,
Hmm.
and it highlights the importance of approaching this topic with an open mind, considering all sides of the story.
I like that.
And this brings us back to a question we posed earlier. How should society approach the complex issue of hallucinogenic substances?
It's a question with no easy answers.
Right.
We've seen the potential for harm, but also the potential for healing and growth.
Yeah.
So how do we find that balance? How do we navigate those possibilities while acknowledging the risks?
Yeah, it really does feel like we're at this crossroads where scientific research, cultural understanding, and societal attitudes are all kind of converging.
Yeah.
It's exciting, but also a bit daunting to think about how we move forward. You hit the nail on the head. It's a complex issue that demands, careful consideration
Right.
and ongoing dialogue. There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
And the way forward will likely depend on the specific substance, the context of its use, and the cultural values of a given society.
So where do we even begin to unpack all of
Well,
this?
one starting point is to recognize that our understanding of these substances is constantly evolving.
Hmm.
What we know today might be completely different tomorrow. That's why continued research is crucial.
And not just scientific research, right? We need to consider the historical and cultural perspectives as well.
Absolutely. Learning from indigenous cultures that have used these substances for centuries could offer valuable insights into how to approach them safely and respectfully.
Yeah, it feels like we've only scratched the surface in this deep dive,
It's true.
but it's definitely sparked a lot of questions and a desire to learn more.
That's the beauty of exploration,
Yeah.
right? Yep. The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
So true.
And that brings us to the core question we've been circling around.
Okay.
How can we as a society approach hallucinogenic substances in a way that balances potential benefits with the inherent risks?
Yeah, we've talked about the science, the history, the cultural context,
Mhm.
and the emerging therapeutic potential.
Right.
But ultimately, it comes down to having open and honest conversations about these substances,
Yeah.
informed by evidence
Yeah.
and respectful of different viewpoints.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that there's no simple solution.
Right.
It's a continuous process of learning, adapting, and making informed decisions based on the best available information.
This deep dive has been quite a journey.
It has.
We started by distinguishing between the different types of hallucinogens,
Right.
then explored how they work on the brain and the subjective experiences they can produce.
We also grappled with the potential long-term effects, both positive and negative, and delved into the evolving landscape of research and therapeutic applications.
And we can't forget the importance of understanding the historical and cultural contexts surrounding these substances.
Absolutely. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought. Given everything we've discussed,
Okay.
what role do you think hallucinogens should play in our society moving forward? How can we navigate this complex terrain responsibly and ethically?
That's a question for all of us to ponder. And if you're interested in continuing this exploration, the course material you shared includes some excellent resources.
Yeah, we'll be sure to link those in the show notes.
Awesome.
Remember, knowledge is power.
Very true.
The more we understand about hallucinogens, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions about their place in our world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Mm.
So stay curious, keep exploring, and until next time, happy diving.